global warming real? Is climate change irreversible? Why are carbon emissions still rising? Join host Dr. Alberto Troccoli, a global leader in climate science and its application to the energy sector, as he unpacks these pressing issues. Through candid conversations with leading experts, get ready to demystify climate change and explore its many layers. So, let's Climunicate!
Hello and welcome to this episode of Let's Climunicate. It's a great pleasure to have with us today Professor John Quiggin from the University of Queensland. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly.
Quiggin.
Quiggin, yes. Thank you, John. And it's great to have you on the podcast. So we'll start by asking you back some information about your interest in economics and also climate change, how you got involved in this, which is what we're going to discuss later, the economic risks of climate change. So if you can tell us a little bit about your background and your studies, how you got to climate change.
So my background is largely in agriculture and resource economics, and that starting out was mostly focused on agriculture, but as time's gone on, the field has really shifted much more to resource concerns. So typically climate change and water are the two big things that tend to consume people in the profession. And so I've been active on climate change for a long time, contributed to the Ghana Review in 2008, I guess it was, which done by the Rudd government, and was then appointed to the Climate Change Authority under the Gillard government. Was on that for 4 or 5 years before resigning, and so I've been active really for at least 20 years in this field.
Excellent. So when you're referring to the prime ministers in Australia, so we are talking about Australia here. We are actually both based in Australia, but we are going to discuss something that is of global interest, climate change.
Yeah.
Yes. So the we start the episodes normally, apart from the background, also with a few quick fire questions for you.
Yeah.
So feel free to skip them if you don't want to answer them. But the first question is your estimate of the change in temperature, changing air temperature in the last 150 years globally. So what's your
1.5 relative to pre-industrial, but
yes. So that's a good ballpark. What percentage of this change and this increase, as you said, would you say is due to human-induced greenhouse gases?
I'm not really sure about the starting point. I think there was there's probably a tiny bit of cooling at the beginning. So I would say about 90% of it is probably human-caused. And
what is your best estimate then for the future, for the temperature? So over the next 80 years, what do you think is going to be the air temperature globally?
So I think it partly depends on policy changes, which until recently have been going in the right direction. They'll clearly go in the wrong direction in the US under Trump. I would hope still for the likely range, the likely range, I think, is likely to be between 2.5 and 3. I would have said 2 earlier, but I think we're seeing a lot of backsliding.
Right. Okay, that's great. And last one is a little trickier, but it is really just to have your understanding, not understanding, but also your, let's say, appreciation for the risk and of this tipping points. So we have tipping points in the physical system, and if you were able to just give us an estimate of how risky these tipping points here in the next 80 years, do you think that we'll reach one of these tipping points, and how risky is it?
I think there will at least be some discontinuous changes. Whether they're big enough to change that estimate, I'm not sure. So I think we'll definitely see at those levels of impact some radical changes, at least to parts of the global climate, but I'm not sufficient an expert to really say. Well, of course, no one knows which ones they are, and no one knows quite which ones will be catastrophic.
Well, I mean, you demonstrated you know quite a lot about this the climate science, which is great. That this was not a test, but just to show it's just to show where we stand, where you stand in the debate of climate change, because we like to interact with people with all sorts of backgrounds, and it's useful to have this compass and these pointers to so before we start the conversation, and then we can dive into the topic of the podcast, which is, like I said, the economic risks of climate change. And I would really start with a generic question, a pretty broad question. You can take it, Britt, where you want. But as an economist, where do you actually start? I mean, for someone on the street, and you tell them, we are assessing the economic risks of climate change. Where do you start? Because there's so much that climate change is doing, and how do we even start? And so.
Yeah, so I guess I would start in some sense with the things which are going to be happening at quite modest rates of climate change already happening, and those are species extinction and then increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters. Those things are already there. As we've said, we're only about 1.5, and those things I think are going to happen even with a relatively successful effort. So there's a big lot of room for, you could call it adaptation, but in general just changes that prepare us to try and protect species whose habitats have been destroyed, and also to protect ourselves against things like sea level rise and catastrophic weather events. Then you get to the higher levels, if indeed we get to 2.5 or 3, as now seems possible, of significant impacts on human systems generally, heat waves in particular, or not merely heat waves, but continued temperatures which are very much antithetical to life in the tropics, and the cost of those, and adverse impacts on agriculture. Then if we somehow go above 3 with the tipping points of things, you start looking at really catastrophic damage. In some sense, not much has been done on that, and it's hard to put numbers on it, other than even if the risk is small, it plays a pretty big calculate when you're trying to work out the costs and benefits of mitigating climate change. Even a small risk of the kind of catastrophic change associated with tipping points weighs pretty heavily in the calculation.
So you described so far the hazards. So there are many hazards that are coming from the climate system, the environment, and so on. But then how do we actually translate these hazards into economic impacts? How do you quantify them in terms of dollars, let's say?
Well, people have done it with, unfortunately, the most popular model, the Nordhaus Dice model, is very unsatisfactory in giving low estimates, particularly trivially low estimates of things like species extinction. I don't know how much value there is in trying to get a precise dollar figure. Once you look at the fact that the numbers for anything above 2 degrees are very large compared to the costs globally of achieving mitigation. So there's no doubt that we could greatly reduce emissions at very low cost. Working out how much bigger the benefits of mitigation are probably isn't worth worrying about too much, given that the policy process isn't going to be a rational process of trying to get the absolute optimal policy. We're going to just muddle through as best we can, or succeed or fail.
And there is this target of net zero now by 2050 that is being discussed. And some people have also costed this. For example, McKinsey put a dollar figure of around $7-8 trillion a year or something, I think it's, if I'm not mistaken. But, so it's the point is that many people argue that it's going to be too expensive to reach this target. And so you were saying that the risk is so high that we should act, but other people say it's too expensive. So how do we actually balance?
Well, I guess I don't buy the story. I mean, 7-8 trillion is roughly 7% of GDP. I haven't done global estimates, but my view of the number for Australia is much more like 1 or 2 trillion. 1 or 2% of GDP, which is roughly 1 or 2 trillion a year, and those costs are actually falling as those costs estimates are falling as, in particular, the combination of solar and batteries looks like a near complete solution by itself. So it's now already at the point where you can run the mythical baseload power, that is a power station that's on 24 hours a day entirely by solar with lots of battery backup, and still be competitive with new gas. So I guess I don't buy stories that the economic cost is very large.
Right, but is there any kind of let's say study that has demonstrated that the 2050 is feasible for?
Well, certainly there's plenty of Australian evidence of the feasibility of decarbonisation of electricity in particular. We're likely to get to 82%. That's the government's target, and we might, depending on what happens, we might get there. We might even overshoot. So, in a sense, electricity is a solved problem. Then the real question is electrification and particularly electrification of transport. But this is essentially a one-off matter of replacing the existing stock of motor vehicles with electrics once we've solved the generation problem. So the studies I've seen certainly show that decarbonisation of the electricity generation system is feasible by 2050. You might leave in a tiny bit of gas, depending on how you want to, how pessimistic or optimistic you are. But that part's feasible, and in essence, decarbonisation of transport is a technically solved problem, and the cost of new electric cars is not significantly greater than the cost of new internal combustion engines. So it's really a matter of policy that stops us. It makes that transition away from buying new IC vehicles as fast as possible. Then there's bits and pieces of more or less intractable problems, or certainly less tractable problems, cement, steel, and so forth. But I think all of those are doable at relatively modest cost.
Right. So you are saying that basically it's achieving the 2050 net zero is physically possible from a technical perspective, and also is not as expensive as some people claim it is. So it is something that we can aim for. And there is also a question of course, particularly in the energy system, it's not just the energy that need to decarbonize, but the energy system has very long time frames to replace all the systems and power plants and so on. So there's also the aspect to consider. But before, you mentioned policy as well. I'd like to go back to the how we approach this also from a global perspective, and then we'll come back also to the Australia case. So from an economic perspective, a policy perspective, how do you judge whether it's better to have a government intervention or leaving these changes to the market forces? And particularly, there's a lot of debate about tax on carbon. So how do we approach this?
Yeah. Well, in my view, certainly we need a price on carbon of some kind, and that's true whether you have a tax or a system of tradable permits, or a bunch of ad hoc measures which effectively make it more costly to pollute. Those are all possibilities, and we need as economists, the differences between a tax and a permit system are pretty limited. I mean, the main one is that if we were in a world where there was a possibility of genuinely global cooperation, permits will be better because they can be translated one for one. If you have taxes, then you have taxes in euros and taxes in US dollars and so forth, and that's difficult to manage. But of course, we're not in that world anyway, so we're really looking at individual countries or blocks doing their own thing or not, as the case may be. In that context, and this has always been my view, really, anything that can get through Parliament or whatever the governing body is, I will support. The differences between different designs, I think, are of second-order importance.
Right. So some economists claim that the actual tax on carbon is key to advancing the goals that we mentioned about the mitigation of climate change. And yet, if you look globally, there is no basically there's no country where the tax is imposed on. There's been a lot of debate. You mentioned also in Australia, and many governments have fallen because of this issue of climate. So in practice, how do we actually solve? I know we have the instruments, but the debate has been going on for 30 years or so on climate, the IPCC, and all these things. So how do we actually resolve it in practice?
Well, of course, we do have tradable permit schemes. The EU has one that's worked very effectively. China has one that's having some effect. I find it difficult to really always parse the news from China. Australia has small scale renewable energy target, which has, because it's the only really working version of this, has driven incredibly high uptake of rooftop solar. We've got the safeguard scheme, which is pretty rubbish, but I suppose has some limited effect. So what we've seen is a bunch of ad hoc kinds of measures that mostly in the tradable permit space, because that's politically proved to be easier in most places, and that's really what we need to do. And as I say, it's certainly worked very effectively in Europe. Largely eliminated coal already from the generation system, for example, and seems to be having some effect in China, although it's unclear who actually has to have the permits and who gets away without it. I can't fully follow it. So what we're seeing is not the way economists like to think, which is we work out the best policy and then get everybody together and implement it. What we're seeing is bits and pieces of mostly what economists would call second best policies that have some kind of appealing. And in the US before Trump, a bunch of industrial policy which was largely aimed at decarbonisation is certainly better than nothing.
And do you reckon that the gas and oil companies globally are accounting for this tax on carbon already, or they mainly claiming that they are, but in practice they're continuing with this oil exploration of oil?
Yeah.
And so
So again, it's always been an element of greenwashing in the sense that really they don't have that much of a future in a decarbonised world. Even no matter what skills you have, you can't really turn an oil company into a wind company. So their interest has always been, in some sense, to delay. I think again, Trump's election has really changed things, so that now they're fairly openly abandoning any attempt to do anything about this. But we'll see how that plays out over however many years this continues.
So you feel optimistic about this transition on?
My optimism is qualified in the sense of we'll end up a lot worse. We could have dealt with this problem starting in say the year 2000 and be well on the way to solving it and have incurred very limited economic costs. That's not going to happen. On the other hand, I think most of the standard projections have been consistently pessimistic. The logic of really cheap solar and batteries, in the end, will, I think, overwhelm most of the resistance. I think when you look at China, they keep on worrying about it, but they're producing 500, 700 gigawatts of solar cells a year. They have to find somewhere, and they're selling them. They're always complaining, but they're selling them very cheaply in a way that I think is undercutting the economics of new coal, certainly undercutting nuclear. Which is, if nuclear were cheap, it would probably be a way to go. But it certainly means that it's completely undercutting new coal nearly everywhere, and I think in the end will lead to that happening also in the couple of places, China and India, that are still developing coal. So I think the logic of that is going to drive things in the right direction. I can't see much progress in the US, but I guess the other side of Trump is that the US, although it's a big country, is essentially going to cease to be an important country. So, and they still can't, even though they can continue to operate existing coal-fired power stations for a while, sooner or later the cost of that will become too much. So I sort of see, I guess, if you go back to what the IPCC was looking at 30 years ago, kind of, I haven't got the numbers to hand, but yeah, there were plenty of scenarios that saw 6 degrees of global warming based, if you just extrapolated what was going to happen. They were there without worrying about anything else. Now I think 3 degrees, which will be bad, is the pessimistic outlook. We still have a reasonable chance of getting to 2, especially if somehow or another the US turns around.
And in terms of, you mentioned the growth in solar, I just want to mention also the fact that it's growing globally at a rate of 30% or more year on year in the last few years. No, it's incredible growth. And going back also to the discussion on taxation on carbon, this is in spite. Obviously, there's a big policy in China to drive towards renewables, but in general, hasn't been. This is mainly around market forces, which is also positive because there's no imposition of taxation. Yeah. But so it seems that the market, but for in other respects, is not quite to the level of the tripling of the renewables that was agreed at COP29. No? So it's there's still some way to go to reach those targets.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult to reach those targets with the abandon, as I say, with the US essentially switching to the other side of the equation. But I think market forces, certainly what we're seeing is this technological forces, the fact that very luckily for us, solar has turned out to be this absolutely miraculous technology that, and I think when you look at the forecast people make, I shouldn't bag the International Energy Agency too much, but there's always a tendency to say this is going to stop or level out soon. Whereas with the cost we're seeing, it's perfectly it's already the case that in lots of places it is or soon will make economic sense to close down a brand new coal-fired power station and replace it with solar and batteries, and similarly, that the economics of gas, I think, are becoming less and less favourable. When you look at the fact there's no sign of the cost reductions in solar slowing. We're really seeing, we've seen, I guess, if we look at the stuff coming out of labs, there's still immense progress happening there. Whereas, of course, there's no progress in gas or coal, and nothing ever gets delivered on nuclear. So we're looking at these big reductions in cost, and we're looking at the point that you can now afford to waste a huge amount of the capacity of solar and still make money. So you can build solar and have 20, 30, 40% curtailment in the middle of the day, and still make your money back. And with batteries, that logic becomes even stronger. And people haven't really factored that in. That if you think about, I think an illustration would be computers. Computers get faster and faster and faster. You might think that's going to stop, and it has slowed down a bit. But at the same time, essentially, a 5-year-old computer is a museum piece, and that I think is going to happen as solar gets drastically cheaper. And there's still a few bonuses out there like geothermal, which might finally come and deliver something too.
So that's good news about the solar and battery, particularly coupling. But at the moment, also as far as I can see, there is the bottleneck is the grid, the transmission lines, because there are some big plants that are being built, and yet they cannot be connected because there's a large cost also involved in the transmission lines to connect all these power plants.
So there's two things. One is the actual economic cost, and the other is sort of NIMBY resistance, and those are both big factors. I think what we're seeing again in the Australian context is the effect of slowdowns there, and generally policy that's weak in most areas, but still strong for domestic, is what we're seeing is this huge growth in home battery systems, because then of course you avoid the you avoid the problems with the grid. And so as the issue is in a sense that the cost advantages are so great that people find a way around those things. If you can't get transmission from a solar farm, you can build a standalone facility right next to it, or you can, which of course is effectively what people are doing with home systems. They're saying, well, I can't get the transmission from a solar farm in the west of the state where there's plenty of sun, but I can put solar on my roof and I can hook it up to a battery, and the more the system punishes me for putting solar back into the network, the better the economics of a battery.
So if we now go back to the case of Australia, you mentioned it a few times. So if we go a little deeper on what's happening in Australia, we have now reached around 35% or more of electrification from renewables.
I think it's higher than that. I mean, I shouldn't have the numbers. Certainly, South Australia is nearly at 100%. I think Queensland is about 70%, and it's the worst, as I recall it. So I don't have an exact number, but we're certainly seeing regular points at which 50% of the grid's being met by renewables.
Yeah, so I was mentioning that now maybe 35 is not quite correct, but there is also a target of 85 by 2040, I think, is it?
82 by 2030, I think.
By 2030, okay. Yeah, so it's quite an ambitious target. So, and yet there's been, like we mentioned, a lot of to and fro in politically governments that have fallen and so on. So but there's some lessons here, interesting lessons, because things have moved on anyway. There's been around 2012, there was a big incentive to have solar power, and that started the big growth. And in spite of pulling out the levers of the benefits, the feed-in tariffs and all the rest, that has continued to grow. So how do you see the future for Australia in terms of renewables?
As I said, the one instrument which is still in place is the small scale renewable energy target, which effectively rewards retailers for supplying people with solar. That if you're supplying solar, if you're burning coal or gas, you need certificates, and the certificates come from small scale renewable energy. So we have that, and that of course only that effectively means households. So that's been driving it. It really shows no signs of stopping, I think. So the electricity part of the story is going well. The motor vehicle part is going terrible. Just the politics of that has been really bad. I don't know where we will see that turn around.
And how do you think is realistic this policy of Australia being a superpower, so enhancing renewables and then turning raw materials into products here in Australia and export them?
Well, sure. There's a bunch. I think one of the points here is a general point which I like to make about storage is that any physically reversible process is a storage technology. So you can have a battery which is moving electrons from one place to another. You can haul a heavy weight up using energy and run it down again, whether that's a solid weight or pumped water. And in some sense, the same is true for these export options, that there's been a lot of enthusiasm about hydrogen, probably mistakenly, I think, at least as an export commodity. I mean, potentially, but we could potentially look at hydrogen as a source for green steel production. We've largely gone out of steel production, but that's a possibility. Ammonia is another possibility, and of course, directly exporting electricity through high voltage direct current. So all of those are possibilities. All of them have problems. I would say the likelihood is once we can really get the cost of power down, that at least one of them will come off.
Excellent. So going back to the discussion on the intervention of the government or the market, I'd like to wrap up the discussion by asking you some suggestions on how you see the normal people, general population, making their contribution to the action on climate. And so rather than waiting for the taxation or other things, what can everyday people do in terms of...
Well, of course, I mean, everyday people, vast numbers of them, of course, have solar power. That's a good, I mean, I think there's most of the easy choices have been made. People who live people who live in apartment buildings, I mean, that's doable, but requires much more of an effort. So that's sort of one frontier where we can really move forward on solar. Electric vehicles, I guess, is a choice everyone can make. There's a bunch of options for energy conservation there, most of which make pretty good economic sense. So a lot of it is paying attention and thinking, well, there's looking at where you're consuming energy in general. Could you replace that energy? Could you replace the energy you're using with solar or wind, or could you do without it? I mean, I think, although I'm not politically fully convinced of the so-called abundance agenda, I think it's been popular in the US. I think that's a large part of the issue. Is here are these opportunities that solar is now really cheap. We could have really abundant electricity and get away, I think, in particular from the kind of what you might call hair shirt reasoning of saying, oh, what we all have to do is give up this and give up that. I think politically that's not a success, and mostly the focus is on second order stuff. Air travel, for example, is a relatively minor contributor to global warming and gets this incredible amount of attention because it speaks to a moral narrative. I suppose although this isn't quite the answer to your question, I think a large part of the answer is get away from moral narratives that say this and just say, look, a molecule is a molecule is a molecule, and how you save it doesn't matter. How we emit less molecules of carbon dioxide and methane, of course, doesn't matter.
And I guess that part of the equation is also being aware of how electricity is consumed, because there is a lot of also inefficiency in the way we use. So what can be the measures that we can pay attention to?
Well, again, I think we've made a mess of this. We have introduced these things called smart meters, which ought to give us the capacity to manage things, but the design of the policy has been a god-awful mess so that people can't really use them as they're supposed to be. So I'm hoping that someone will come along and fix this in due course, but I haven't had much impact. That would, in principle, enable us to, for example, organise things so we're using less energy using more energy in the middle of the day when it's cheap and less at times when it's expensive. The technology is there, but in Australia, the policy is complicated and can't be done by an individual, and we have made an awful mess of it.
Right. Okay. So we have some good pointers and things to ponder about, and so we'd like to thank you, John, for being on the podcast and for sharing all your insights. And thanks again. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to explore our other interviews and subscribe to our channel to receive notifications about future episodes.